Imagine an organization meant to stop dictators that is run almost entirely by dictators. Well, you don't have to, because that's the African Union. Africa has wars that last decades, presidents who never leave office, elections where the winner is congratulated before the counting is finished. And yet Africa has a continental organization with summits, speeches, flags, and declarations that were created to stop exactly this. It's meant to prevent conflict, protect civilians, and defend democracy. So the question is why, after more than 20 years, the outcomes barely change? The African Union was created in 2002. It replaced an older organization called the Organization of African Unity, which had a reputation for doing absolutely nothing. The OAU believed deeply in non-interference, which usually meant politely watching while countries collapse. So the African Union was supposed to be different. No more silence during massacres, no more shielding dictators out of solidarity, and no more hiding behind sovereignty. The slogan was ambitious: African solutions to African problems. It sounded like a turning point, except it wasn't. Here's the part that explains everything. The African Union is not run by judges or civil society or ordinary Africans. It's run by African presidents, and a significant number of those presidents are authoritarian, strongmen, or leaders who've stayed in power by rigging elections, rewriting constitutions, or silencing opposition. Which means the AU is not neutral. It's a club. And like most clubs, it exists to protect its members. Once you understand that, the African Union's behavior stops being confusing and starts being predictable. So when we say the African Union is run by presidents, it's worth being specific about who that actually means. This is an organization whose leadership includes men who have ruled their countries for decades, presidents who've removed term limits, leaders who've jailed opposition figures, governments accused of torture, disappearances, and shooting protesters in the street. In Uganda, power has not changed hands in essentially 40 years. In Cameroon, the president has ruled since the early 1980s. In Equatorial Guinea, one family has governed since 1979. And in Eritrea, there hasn't been a national election. Ever. These aren't fringe cases. These are voting members of the African Union. And if these leaders cannot protect the rights of their own citizens in their own countries, it's unrealistic to expect them to protect the rights of an entire continent. Take elections as an example. Across Africa, elections are often disputed, criticized by observers, and followed by arrests or violence. And yet when results are announced, something remarkable happens. Presidents congratulate each other. When Yoweri Museveni was declared the winner after another heavily criticized election, African leaders rushed to praise Uganda's democratic process. There was no emergency summit, no sanctions, no outrage. Apparently, if you rig elections carefully enough, you're not a threat to democracy. You're a respected colleague. And this pattern repeats itself across the continent, because punishing election rigging would require leaders to punish behavior they might need themselves one day. That's not hypocrisy. That's self-preservation. This design flaw becomes obvious in moments of crisis. In Darfur, AU peacekeepers were deployed, but they were underfunded, lightly armed, and restricted from stopping attacks. In practice, this meant watching villages burn and writing reports about it. In Libya, the African Union proposed negotiations. NATO launched airstrikes. Guess which one actually shaped the outcome? Not AU. The result was a destroyed state, armed militias, open slave markets, and more than a decade of instability. In Tigray, the country that hosts the AU headquarters, communications were cut, aid was blocked, and civilians were starving. The AU hesitated, it avoided confrontation, and it waited until international pressure forced action. These aren't isolated mistakes, they are the natural outcome of an organization that cannot confront the people who control it. And this is exactly why the African Union can never seriously police its own members. Because enforcement would mean leaders judging leaders. It would mean presidents deciding that staying in power too long is wrong while staying in power themselves. It would mean condemning repression abroad while justifying it at home. So instead of drawing hard lines, the AU lowers the bar. Violence becomes instability, repression becomes internal affairs, and time, not justice, becomes the solution. People who defend the African Union often say things like, what about the United Nations? They're useless too. And that is true. The UN is deeply, deeply flawed. But there's an important difference. When the UN fails, it usually fails loudly. This means it can point to a Security Council and say, we are blocked by the United States, or we are blocked by China, or we're blocked by Russia. In other words, the UN often fails because it has powerful outsiders opposing it. The African Union doesn't have that excuse. There's no external veto, no superpower blocking intervention. So when the AU does nothing, it's because its own members choose to do exactly nothing. And for all its failures, the UN has actually coordinated disease control, refugee protection, and large-scale humanitarian responses. The AU's most visible output, by contrast, remains attending summits, making declarations, and very serious group photos. The African Union doesn't lead Africa, it reflects it. It mirrors the priorities, fears, and power structures of its members, which means expecting the AU to be more democratic, more accountable, and more courageous than the governments that run it was always unrealistic. There's another uncomfortable truth that rarely gets talked about: money. Much of the African Union's budget is paid for by external donors, especially the European Union, not just for conferences or reports, but for core operations, peacekeeping missions, security, logistics, even basic administrative functions. In some years, external donors have covered the majority of the AU's operating budget, so Africa's continental organization often survives on someone else's credit card. Now, that dependency has consequences, because when funding comes from outside, decision-making becomes cautious. The goal shifts from enforcement to stability, from accountability to keeping everyone at the table. The AU isn't free to act boldly if bold actions risk funding cuts, diplomatic fallouts, or internal collapse. So instead of decisive interventions, we get statements. Instead of consequences, we get consultations. What makes the failure so tragic is not because Africa lacks capable people. It's the opposite. Africa has diplomats who understand conflict prevention, lawyers who understand constitutional limits, civil servants who know exactly what should be done. What's missing is an institution that puts these ideas above presidential comfort. A truly people-centric African Union would act early, not late. It would protect civilians first and worry about political fallout second. But that would require leaders being held accountable by the very institution they control, and that line has never been crossed. The African Union was created to protect Africans. Instead, it protects African rulers. It could have saved lives, prevented countless deaths, built a more self-reliant and prosperous Africa, and promoted true Pan-Africanism. Unfortunately, it didn't. So judge by outcomes, not speeches or declarations. The African Union may be the most useless organization in the world.